people in the US and Western Europe often claim to be in free, independent, open societies. But if you look at the insane propaganda in the media, it's really like you're seeing some of the most brainwashed societies on earth. And I'll start today talking about something that is just absolutely hilarious, which I mean, it shouldn't be that hilarious, but it really just shows the extreme lengths to which the U.S. government claims that any country that challenges its interest is a threat to so-called national security. And that is, if you are an American, did you realize that the country of Ethiopia is now an unusual and extraordinary threat to the United States? That doesn't come from me. That comes from the White House, the mouth of President Joe Biden, who just declared today, September 17th, that the country of Ethiopia constitutes an unusual and an extraordinary threat to the national security and foreign policy of the United States. Moreover, Biden declared a national emergency to deal with the so-called threat posed by a conflict in Ethiopia. Now, it's absolutely crazy to anyone who's outside of the little bubble of the U.S. foreign policy consensus. Clearly, East African nations are not in any way threatening the actual American people. But this is related to a conflict that has really heated up in the past several months. You might have seen that my colleague Max and I did a live stream focused on the conflict in Ethiopia and Eritrea with this group called the Tigrayan People's Liberation Front, the TPLF, which launched an attack on the government in Ethiopia in November of last year and has essentially been waging a kind of civil war with the backing of the US. And we see the same so-called humanitarian interventionist warriors like Samantha Power, like Antony Blinken, these figures who in the Obama administration helped to destroy the country of Libya, which today still has no central government. It still is facing a massive internal crisis with refugees fleeing, with violence, with warlords controlling different parts of this once very prosperous country, which is also very oil rich, of course, Libya. So the great humanitarian benefactors who brought their so-called R2P, responsibility to protect doctrine, to Libya at the nose of a gun, at the nose of a missile, rather, at the barrel of a gun, they're now trying to repeat that policy in Ethiopia and Eritrea. Let me continue reading from how insanely ridiculous this executive order on imposing sanctions on certain persons with respect to the humanitarian and human rights crisis in Ethiopia is. Biden says, he cites the legal precedents. He says, I, Joseph Biden Jr., find that the situation in and in relation to northern Ethiopia, which has been marked by activities that threaten the peace, stability, and security and stability of Ethiopia and the greater Horn of Africa region, in particular, widespread violence, atrocities, and serious human rights abuse, including those involving ethnic-based violence, rape, and other forms of gender-based violence, and obstruction of humanitarian operations, constitute an unusual and extraordinary threat to the national security and foreign policy of the United States. Note how they conflate national security and foreign policy as if those were both the same thing, even though, in fact, they're usually the opposite. The more something threats U.S. foreign policy, in scare quotes, usually the better it is for U.S. national security. And usually the better something is for actual national security, for actual people in the United States, it's usually a so-called threat to U.S. foreign policy, because U.S. foreign policy, that is imperialism, is a direct threat to actual national security. But it's redefined to mean whatever the U.S. empire wants to do this week. And note how, again, we see, just as with the lead up to the humanitarian interventionist war that destroyed the country of Libya, that destroyed the state, notice how it uses some of the same talking points: widespread violence, atrocities, human rights abuse, ethnic-based violence, rape, other forms of gender-based violence. These are the same talking points used to destroy and pillage the country of Libya. Let's not forget. It was the Obama administration, or as it's now called, the Obama-Biden administration, that claimed that Muammar Gaddafi, the leader of Libya, was supposedly giving his soldiers Viagra to rape women. A complete lie. Total lie. Fake news from the White House, from the Hillary Clinton State Department. And what happened? These fake human rights groups like Amnesty International at first echoed these totally false claims, and then they did a backtrack later on and said, actually, there's no evidence of that. But they did that after NATO destroyed the country of Libya, and not only destroyed the government, but created this refugee crisis that led to bringing back slavery to what had once been the most prosperous country in Africa, that is Libya. There are now open-air slave markets for sub-Saharan African refugees, thanks to the Obama, Biden, Hillary Clinton administration. And now, with the great success in Libya, they want to repeat that glorifying, amazing success in Ethiopia and Eritrea. The U.S. government is supporting this insurgent group, the TPLF, to try to destabilize the region, to prevent Ethiopia and Eritrea from continuing to have peaceful relations, which they finally did after years of conflict fueled by the U.S., when the TPLF was in the government, and when the TPLF invaded Somalia and invaded Eritrea with the support of the U.S. Well, now the TPLF left power, and there's a new president, Abiy Ahmed, and the U.S. is very much destabilizing him and destabilizing the region, which is ironic, because if you look back at the executive order here, what does Biden say? It's absolutely hilarious. Threatening the stability of Ethiopia and the Greater Horn of Africa region. It's the U.S. that is threatening the peace, security, and stability of Ethiopia and the Horn of Africa for its own geopolitical, geostrategic reasons, because this is, of course, a very important region of the world. It is right next to the Bab el-Mandeb Strait, where millions of barrels of oil go through every day, where a huge percentage of global trade goes through, and that leads up to the Suez Canal, and it connects European trade routes to Asian trade routes to African trade routes. So it's the U.S. that is stabilizing the region like usual. And of course, why did Biden make this insane declaration that the country of Ethiopia supposedly threatens U.S. national security? Ding, here we have the answer. It's very obvious, because now this gives Washington unilateral authority to impose sanctions, that is economic warfare, on Ethiopia and Eritrea. Now, the U.S. has already imposed sanctions on Eritrea and taken punitive measures against Ethiopia. So this is just going to continue escalating the addiction that the U.S. empire has to waging economic warfare around the world. So as if it weren't enough that the U.S. is waging economic war on China, Russia, Venezuela, Cuba, Nicaragua, Iran, Syria. I mean, you can go down the list. Zimbabwe, Yemen, Lebanon. I mean, there's so many other countries. Somalia, the U.S., North Korea. The U.S. has sanctions, in many cases, brutally murderous sanctions on all of those countries I just named and more. In fact, over a quarter of the global population lives in countries suffering under U.S. sanctions, that is economic warfare, illegal under international law because they're not approved by the UN Security Council. So the U.S. is waging economic war on the countries that represent 1/4 of the global population, including the biggest country on earth, China, and including some of its own so-called allies. We saw Washington threaten sanctions on Germany, its own so-called ally in scare quotes, and now it's expanding that even further to Ethiopia and Eritrea. Ethiopia is, of course, the second largest country on the African continent, and the U.S. continues to destabilize it because with Washington as Henry Kissinger, the war criminal who will never die because he made some kind of demonic pact with Satan, as he said, the U.S. has no allies. It only has interests. And we see that again and again.